Don't talk to the old maid in the corner, she's just tagging along. Nina's voice sliced through the air like a cold wind off the lake. I froze, fingers still clutching the leather strap of my old handbag. The lobby of the resort I had once designed echoed with silence for half a second, then resumed with fake laughter, polite murmurs, the usual hum of a luxury retreat. Except my ears were burning. She was pointing at me, no worse. She wasn't even looking. Just a flick of her manicured hand toward my direction, like swatting away an invisible insect. Garrett chuckled nervously beside her, eyes locked on the phone screen where the live chat pinged with hearts and fire emojis. None of those were for me. The young man behind the counter, he looked barely 25, stiffened. His eyes shifted between Nina's camera and my face, then quickly dropped to the tablet in front of him. "Yes, ma'am," he said, but his voice cracked slightly. I saw it, the brief flicker of confusion, then recognition. My name was still in their records. Henrietta Lowell, lead architect, Lake Arrowhead Serenity Resort. Completion date June 2005. He knew, but he said nothing. No one did. I stepped back, my orthopedic heels clicking softly on the marble floor. My blouse, ivory silk ironed with care that morning, suddenly felt wrong, out of place. Nina had asked me to blend in earlier. Now I knew what she meant. The sun filtered in through the massive windows, casting golden streaks across the pinewood walls. I had chosen those beams. I remembered the shipment being delayed and spending nights recalculating load distribution just so the lobby would look like this. Now I stood like a forgotten artifact within it. "Ignore her, folks," Nina smiled to the camera, turning the screen back to herself. "Anyway, day one of our lake healing journey starts right here. I'm so excited to share this transformation space with you." A transformation space. My fingers twitched. I wasn't angry yet. No, anger comes later. This was a slow rip beneath the skin. The feeling of being stripped layer by layer, not by cruelty, but by erasure. I turned toward the wall where a metal plaque gleamed quietly. A name etched in brass, HL. They didn't know. She didn't know. I walked toward it, my steps slow but steady, each one absorbing the sting of humiliation and repurposing it into resolve. Behind me, the live chat buzzed louder. "Who's the old woman? Why's she in the shot? Looks like someone's grandma crashed the scene, lol." I didn't flinch. The concierge, a woman closer to my age with silver at her temples, caught my eye. For a split second, I saw something shift in her face. Recognition, a quiet kind of apology. She mouthed, "Miss Lowell." I nodded once, and kept walking. I didn't confront Nina. I didn't correct her on camera. I didn't even speak. Not yet. There's a time for silence. And a time for revelation. That day I chose silence, but not surrender, because the walls remembered me. The floors still tilted exactly as I had calculated them to. The light streamed in precisely where I had intended. This place was mine, whether they acknowledged it or not. And I would remind them. Not with shouting, but with presence. I passed the water feature I had insisted be placed just beside the north pillar, a subtle trick to soften the acoustics in the main lobby. I could still hear its calming trickle even as Nina's voice bounced shallowly around the corners. Healing at the lake, she had called it. What she didn't know was that the lake had already been healed. Years ago, by me. I reached the far end of the lobby, beyond the view of her camera, beyond the comments and lights. There, in a quiet alcove, hung the original blueprint of the resort, framed, yellowed slightly but intact. My signature at the bottom, bold, clear, HL. I stood in front of it. And for the first time that day, I smiled. Let them talk. Let them ignore. I had built this place from dirt and stubbornness, from 2 a.m. coffee and splinters, from heartbreak and drafts and revisions. And now I would build something else. Not a building, but a moment. A reminder. A reckoning. Let the camera roll, dear. Because this old maid, she remembers everything. Pause. If your own family silenced your worth in front of the world, what would you do? A. Walk away quietly. B. Speak up gently. C. Reveal your truth. D. Show them who you really are. July 2005. The smell of fresh cedar hit me the moment I stepped out of the truck. Sharp, honest, raw. I pulled my hard hat tighter against the sun, adjusted the rolled-up blueprints under my arm, and looked up at the bare bones of what would soon become Lake Arrowhead Serenity Resort. It didn't look like much yet. Framing half-finished, scaffolding groaning under the afternoon heat, men in dusty jeans yelling measurements across raw wood beams. But I saw it. I saw the lobby bathed in golden light. I saw the curved staircase I fought for in every city hall meeting. I saw quiet mornings and gentle footsteps across oak floors. I saw women older, weary, worthy, sitting on porches sipping tea and breathing again. This place wasn't just a design. It was a rebellion. Against forgetfulness. Against the notion that luxury had to be loud and youth had to lead. "You, the architect," a voice barked from behind. I turned. Foreman. Mid-50-second. Sweat-stained clipboard. Eyebrow arched like he expected me to flinch. "Yes," I said. Calm. Clear. He squinted at me for a second, then nodded and shouted to the crew, "Heads up, architect on deck." They didn't pause. No one clapped. One of them whistled low, not out of disrespect but disbelief. A woman, at 74, calling the shots. I made my way into the unfinished lobby. The pine beams were finally up. I touched one lightly, fingers brushing over a knot in the wood. It was warm, solid. I had spent nights adjusting the angles on the drawing board, 1 degree here, another there, just to make sure sunlight would fall at precisely the right corner by 9 a.m. Not because anyone asked. Because I knew what it felt like to step into a room and feel like you didn't belong, to look for the light and find none. This resort was going to change that. It was going to be for us, for the invisible, for the women called too much or too old or in the way. I walked across the concrete floor, stepping over cables and scattered planks. The blueprint unrolled a bit under my arm, and I stopped, kneeling on one knee. From this very spot, I imagined the reception desk. Cherry wood. Sleek but warm. Not intimidating. I'd chosen the grain myself. "You all right there, ma'am?" one of the workers asked as he passed, lugging a coil of wire. I smiled. "Just measuring something no one else can see yet." He didn't get it, but I did. The wind picked up slightly, rattling the plastic sheeting overhead. Light flickered through, uneven, imperfect. But still light. And that was enough. The house was quiet when I got home. Santa Fe light had already faded into that soft blue haze where sky meets desert in a kind of hush only summer understands. I placed my blueprint roll beside the door and took off my boots slowly, one by one. My knees ached. My palms still smelled faintly of pine resin. On the kitchen table sat a single envelope, thick cream-colored, with my name handwritten in black ink. Henrietta Lowell. I didn't open it right away, just stared at it for a moment, letting the cool silence wrap around me. Outside wind brushed against the adobe walls like a soft breath. Garrett walked in from the guest room, barefoot, hair tousled from a nap. "Hey, Mom," he said, rubbing his eyes. "You're back late." "I stayed to check the south beams," I replied. He looked down at the envelope. "That for you." I nodded. "Open it." I sat, pulled the tab open, careful not to tear the edge. Inside, a letter, embossed, official. "The California Board of Architectural Recognition is proud to honor Miss Henrietta Lowell as Architect of the Year for her innovative design and contribution to community-centered space. Asterisk. Me fingers trembled. Garrett leaned over my shoulder, reading quietly. "Wait," he whispered. "They picked you." I turned to him, unsure whether to smile or cry. Maybe both. He reached for the blueprint I had left on the chair, unrolled it halfway across the floor. "This is the resort?" he asked. "Yes, you built this." He didn't mean just the wood or the glass. He meant the vision, the stubborn nights, the moments I questioned if they'd ever let a woman design something this size without slapping a man's name on it. "Yes," I said again, quieter this time. He didn't say anything else. He just sat on the floor, knees bent, staring at the drawing as if it were a painting. The fan above creaked once. Outside, a coyote howled far off in the hills. The smell of my lavender hand cream lingered faintly in the air. Garrett finally spoke. "Mom, This is beautiful. It wasn't praise. It was recognition. And somehow that mattered more. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and slid it into the drawer beneath my kitchen phone. Not to hide it, just to hold it close. Some things you build with hands, others with everything you've ever been. And this was both. The beige t-shirt sat on the edge of my bed like a dare, folded crisp, still warm from the dryer. I picked it up, ran my fingers along the seam. Cotton blend, cheap, light enough to disappear under sunlight. The same exact shade as the stucco walls in the breakfast lounge. Nina tapped on the doorframe. Hey, I brought you something. Just something neutral. Let's not ruin the aesthetic, okay? She smiled. Wide, professional, polished. I stared at the shirt. Thanks, I said quietly. Behind her, Garrett adjusted the tripod in the hallway, eyes focused on his screen hands, too busy to interfere. Nina lingered a moment longer, eyes scanning my room. Oh, and maybe, could you leave your purse? It kind of clashes with the wood tones. Then she walked away, her sandals making soft clicks down the tile hallway. I stood still in my linen nightgown, holding the nothing-colored shirt. Heat gathered at my neck. Not fury. Something else. Something slower, quieter. Shame. The kind that seeps in through politeness. I dressed in silence. The fabric clung in all the wrong places. Loose where I used to have shoulders. Tight where my body had changed. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see myself. I saw background, set decoration, a shadow behind the story. Downstairs, the terrace buzzed. Staff laid out lavender juice and spirulina waffles. White chairs formed a perfect arc in the sun. Garrett arranged camera angles. Nina posed with her green smoothie teeth, bright shoulders turned just enough to catch light. Let's do one with the whole family, she called out. Okay, everyone. 1, 2, wait. Mom, could you scoot out just for this one? We're doing a tighter crop. I stepped back. 3 paces. 4. Far enough that I became furniture. Perfect, she said. It looks so much cleaner this way. The shutter clicked. I didn't flinch. Not anymore. Hurt didn't come with yelling. It came wrapped in pastel tones and perfect lighting. It came as soft corrections, casual edits, little nudges that erased you a millimeter at a time. Breakfast with the best crew. Healing at the lake. I took a plate and found a seat at the edge of the terrace. A wicker bench no one else had noticed. I tried not to spill jam on the shirt. A server poured coffee somewhere behind me. I didn't turn. I just sipped, eyes on the dock below where a dragonfly traced lazy circles across the lake. I had designed that path, measured its slope by hand, argued for the curved stones so it would feel like walking through a stream. No one asked. No one knew. And somehow that stung more than anything else. I stood, brushed a few crumbs from my lap, and walked toward the far garden path. The terrace faded behind me, voices, cameras, laughter softening into background noise. Gravel crunched underfoot. A warm breeze slipped through the trees, stirring the lavender and sage that lined the walkway. It had been years since I walked this exact route. Past the fountain, past the iron arch I once designed to catch the morning light. Toward the lower patio where the old brick still held the faint lines of chalk if you looked close enough. That was where I had first sketched the resort. On my knees, with white chalk on raw stone. No permit. No committee. Just vision. A voice called out from behind. Excuse me, miss. Are you Nina's assistant? I turned. A young woman stood there, early 20s, clipboard in hand, wide eyes, hair pulled back too tight. She wore a linen apron and a headset that looked too large for her frame. He blinked. She waited, polite, expectant. I smiled. Just enough. No, I said softly. Not quite. She tilted her head, confused, but didn't press. She walked back toward the staff tent, already distracted by her checklist. I stayed still for a long moment. The sky was bluer here, away from the building. The garden opened wide, curved edges, asymmetrical beds, rough stone walls exactly 3 feet high. Nothing in this place was accidental. Even the crookedness had a blueprint. I stepped into the corner where the brick was oldest. Some of the white chalk lines still clung to the cracks faded, now nearly invisible. But I knew where to look. I had traced the curve of the main wing right here, on a hot July afternoon, my hand shaking not from doubt, but from awe. I remember Garrett coming by after work bringing me lemonade. I remember sketching with one hand and swatting flies with the other. I remember sweat trickling down my back, the hum of construction nearby, and the quiet certainty that this mess of chalk and sunburn and stubbornness would become something lasting. I crouched slowly, knees cracking, and ran my fingers along the brick. The texture was the same. Rough, honest. I let my hand rest there flat against the warm stone. No cameras, no microphones, no captions. Just me and memory. I didn't need a title. I didn't need their permission to exist here. Every stone remembered. And now, I was starting to remember too. I hadn't meant to eavesdrop. It was late afternoon, the sun dripping gold across the hallway. I was on my way to the library room, a cozy space I had designed with wide windows and mismatched chairs, when I heard voices behind the frosted glass of the business center. Garrett and Nina. I slowed. Just a release form, Nina said. Her voice was calm, clipped. We're simplifying the branding. Her name doesn't need to be on anything. Silence. Then Garrett, quieter. But she helped design. She helped Nina cut in 18 years ago. This is about now. You said she wanted to stay out of the spotlight, right? Another pause. Paper rustled. It's not erasing her, Nina added. It's just not complicating things. I stood still, not moving, not breathing. There was a long exhale, his, maybe hers. A chair creaked. Then the faint scratch of a pen on paper. I stepped back before I even realized it. Turned. Walked away. Not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because the emptiness hit before anger could form. It was one thing to be ignored on camera, passed over in pictures, treated like a guest in a place you had poured your soul into. But this was something else. To be discussed behind glass, as a detail, a complication, a line on a form, and, worse, to hear your child agree. I moved slowly down the hallway. My shoes tapped lightly against the old hardwood floors. I had picked this flooring myself, salvaged maple, sealed just enough to hold its creaks. I wanted guests to hear each other move, to remind them they weren't alone. Garrett had once run down this same hallway at 6 years old, barefoot, giggling, chocolate on his chin. I remember chasing after him, pretending to be a sea monster. He screamed with laughter, slipping into my arms like he belonged there forever. Now, he signed things. Forms, agreements, releases. And let me go without protest. A cleaning cart passed me at the end of the corridor. The young attendant nodded politely. Good afternoon, ma'am. Afternoon, I answered, voice steady. I stopped beside one of the windows overlooking the east garden. The shadows were long now, soft, reaching. I pressed my palm against the glass. Cool, clear. I could still see the layout, every walkway, every stone, every plant I had picked for blooming in late July. They were still here, even if I wasn't allowed to be. I didn't cray. Didn't rage. I just stood. One hand on the glass, one foot in the past, the other inching toward something I hadn't yet named. But it was coming. I could feel it in my bones. There was a knock at the door. Soft, hesitant. I glanced at the clock, nearly 10. Come in, I called already, knowing who it was. Garrett stepped inside, still in his resort polo and khaki shorts. His hair was slightly tousled, like he'd been running his fingers through it too much. Hey, he said, standing in the doorway like a guest. Evening, I replied, folding the book I hadn't been reading. He hesitated, then took a few steps in. How are you holding up? He asked. I smiled. Not too wide, not too cold. I'm fine, I said. He sat on the edge of the armchair across from me, fidgeted with the hem of his shirt. The silence filled in like water. I didn't bring up the release form, neither did he. Instead, I nodded toward the hallway beyond the door. Do you remember the towel fort? I asked. His eyes flicked up. The one you made when you were 6. You used every spare towel from the linen closet, built a fortress from the bedroom to the end of the hall. He chuckled, quietly. I used books for walls and coat hangers for swords. You made me crawl through a tunnel of bathrobes just to deliver you grapes, I added. That got a real laugh, brief but warm, then quiet again. I forgot about that, he said. I didn't, I said softly. He shifted in the chair, looked at the window, then the carpet, but not at me. The air between us wasn't hostile. It wasn't tense. It was tired, like a room where something had been removed but the outline still lingered. You were always building things, I said. Even then. He nodded. I guess I learned that from you. I didn't respond. There was too much I could say. And none of it would land where I wanted. He stood after a while, brushing his palms against his thighs. I should get some sleep, he said. Early shoot tomorrow. Of course. He walked to the door, paused. Night, Mom. Good night, Garrett. The door closed with a soft click. I sat still for a long moment. Then crossed the room to the small dresser, opened the bottom drawer. Inside was a single faded towel, soft, worn thin at the edges. One of the ones from that summer. I had kept it, stashed it here years ago when the resort first opened. I held it for a second, then folded it slowly. Edges aligned, corners crisp. I placed it back in the drawer and closed it gently. Some things you don't throw away. You just learn how to carry them differently. The sun was already high by the time I reached the spa lawn. They had set up low white loungers beside the saltwater plunge pools. Bowls of sliced citrus gleamed under glass domes. Mint-scented towels rolled into neat spirals. I wore my wide-sleeved linen blouse and soft cotton pants, light loose, appropriate. I had even brought the beige shirt in my bag just in case. Nina was directing the staff like she was born with a headset. Okay, camera 1 is on the herbal steam dome. Camera 2, get the footpath reveal. Garrett, can we mic the lounge set? She saw me. Paused. Hey, Henny, she said with a tight smile. Actually, small change of plan. We're keeping this segment youth-centered. I raised an eyebrow just slightly. It's more about like energy, today, she continued. You know, the younger vibe. Nothing personal. Just older energy doesn't really fit the mood. She said it like she was choosing wallpaper. Garrett looked at the ground. No one said anything else. I nodded. Once. And walked away. Not fast. Not slow. Just enough to feel each step press into the trimmed grass like it mattered. I passed the edge of the spa area and found a quiet bench near the lotus pond. The lilies were open, pale pink, calm, drifting. I sat. The air was warm but not heavy. A breeze tugged gently at my sleeve. The fabric fluttered once, then stilled. They didn't want me in the frame. Not angry, not dismissive, just erased. I folded my hands in my lap and stared at the water. This used to be the elders' space. I had designed it that way, south-facing soft light surrounded by herbs that ease the joints. A spot meant for recovery, reflection, gentle rest. Now it was background. Excuse me, ma'am. I looked up. A young woman mid-20s maybe stood holding a tray with a bottle of cucumber water and a cool towel. Her name tag read Lila. She hesitated, then leaned in just a bit. If it helps, she whispered. I know who you are. Our eyes met. She smiled, faint but full. And for the first time that morning, I felt seen. I didn't cry, didn't reach for the water, just nodded. Thank you, I said. She straightened, gave a small nod back, and walked off without another word. I watched the breeze ripple the pond. A dragonfly landed near my foot, stayed for a second, then lifted again, soundless. The spa crew clapped behind me as Nina shouted, "Perfect shot." But none of that sound reached here. This was my space once, and somehow, still was. Dusk painted the resort in soft shadows. Lanterns along the footpaths glowed amber. The smell of rosemary and lemon balm drifted through the air as I walked slow and aimless, hands tucked into the loose pockets of my sweater. My feet found their way to the central courtyard. Laughter bubbled ahead. Two young women posed with their arms stretched wide, spinning in front of a large brick wall. Their friend knelt nearby, holding a phone, shouting, "One more, the lighting's perfect." The wall had a name now. A black and gold plaque read, "The Influencer Wall." I stopped. Watched. The bricks glowed with the last of the sun. Shadow and light rippled through the narrow slits I had left between each block. Not an accident. I'd designed it that way, light filtration calibrated to shift gently from 6:00 to 7:30 p.m. It was never meant for selfies. It was meant for stillness. A place to pause and feel how light could move through space without needing to explain itself. I remembered marking the dimensions with chalk, hammering the stakes with sore hands, arguing with a contractor who called it too fussy. He left the job. I stayed. Brick by brick, I stood there every afternoon for weeks, adjusting pattern spacing, color tones. And now, it was a backdrop. "Tag me," one of the girls squealed, flipping her hair. I smiled just barely. Then stepped closer, letting my hand rest against the warm brick. Rough? Familiar? It hummed slightly with heat held from the day. Someone behind me adjusted a tripod. A camera's red light blinked to life. Live stream. From the corner of my eye, I saw Nina's silhouette further down the path, mic-clipped smile locked in. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did. Either way, I stepped backward out of the frame. Into the shadow. Let the light fall where it wanted. No resistance. No bitterness. Just choice. My fingertips traced one of the bricks, slightly chipped, still holding its place after all these years. I turned and walked the long way around the courtyard. The laughter faded. The camera light blinked behind me, looking for something more current, more styled. I passed under a pergola I once designed to catch jasmine wind. It still did. I breathed in deeply, let it fill my chest. Legacy doesn't always shout. Sometimes it hums. And sometimes it waits. For you to remember that you never needed to be seen to be felt. The lawn was set like a stage. White chairs arranged in perfect arcs. A lavender arch framed the view of the lake, and beyond it, rows of cameras stood blinking red, their lenses fixed on Nina. She stood in the center, radiant in a cream jumpsuit, palms open like a preacher voice floating over a wireless mic. Welcome, everyone. Today's live stream is all about healing through space, how design can support your soul, and how this beautiful resort embodies balance, light, and peace. Applause. The comment stream scrolled fast on her tablet screen, hearts and clapping hands flashing non-stop. I stood at the far edge of the veranda, half in shadow. Not in the frame. I watched as she gestured toward the brick wall, the spa, the arches. "This walkway," she said, "was designed to guide your body into calm alignment." My fingers tightened around the cane I hadn't used all week. Not because I needed it, but because I knew it made me smaller. A voice behind me, soft but certain, spoke to a guest nearby. "You know, she didn't design this." What the woman asked, tilting her head. An older staff member, the concierge from my first day, nodded toward the lawn. "Miss Lowell did," she said. "She built it. She's right there." The guest turned. So did the woman beside her. And the man with the camera. Someone in the live stream comment feed typed, "Wait, isn't that HL?" Another added, "Henrietta Lowell, Architect of the Year, 2005. Nina glanced at her screen, paused, smiled tighter. "Oh, yes, the original architect contributed to the structure, but of course we've evolved the space since then to suit a more modern, holistic vision." Her voice clipped the end of the sentence. The camera twitched, unsure where to go. Garrett stood behind her, arms crossed, eyes shifting between the screen and me. He didn't say a word. I stepped off the veranda, onto the lawn, not rushed, not grand, just walking. Conversation quieted as I passed. I reached a cluster of guests near the herb path, 4, maybe 5, holding glasses of green juice, blinking curiously. I smiled at them. "Would you like to know what this garden was originally meant for?" I asked. They nodded, hesitant. I lifted my hand and pointed. The path curves slightly west, not by accident. It catches the 10 a.m. sun, Warms the basil beds so the scent travels all the way to the spa dome. They looked down the path surprised. It was built for women over 60, I added to sit, to rest their knees. The bench is angled to support your lower back. You won't notice until you do. Someone raised a phone. Started recording. The concierge stepped forward and whispered, "May I follow your tour?" I nodded. One by one, others began to drift over. Not loudly, not with fanfare, but with a quiet, curious kind of reverence. Nina's voice trailed off in the background, still speaking about wellness flow and energetic alignment. But the cameras were turning. Now they faced me. The tour grew with every step. By the time we reached the wooden footbridge over the stream bed, a dozen people trailed behind me. Some whispered to each other, others recorded with their phones. No one interrupted. I spoke gently. This bridge was designed without handrails, not because we forgot them, but because we wanted to give space for trust. The curve under your feet subtle, but enough to remind your body you're still in control. A man with gray temples stopped filming and looked at me. "My wife uses a cane," he said. "She walked this earlier. Said it felt easy." I nodded. That was the point. Hashtags began appearing in comment threads. The real architect, quiet genius. Respect her name. Further down the path, a young couple pointed to the bench beneath the sycamore. This was where she showed the sunlight trick, one of them told another. The warmth line at 10 a.m. Nina stood at the edge of the lawn, still in frame, still smiling. But her jaw was tight now. She glanced at Garrett, who looked like he might speak then, didn't. He walked toward me instead. "Mom," he said softly. "They're filming you." "I know," I said. "You okay?" I looked at him. "I'm not trying to steal your spotlight," I said. "Just reclaiming my footprint." He opened his mouth, closed it. "I didn't know it meant that much to you." "It's not about meaning," I replied. "It's about memory." Another camera turned, then another. I continued walking, stopped by the original foundation stone. It was small, barely noticed, but I placed my foot beside it just as I had the day we laid it. "This stone came from a quarry 2 towns over," I told the group. "I hauled it here myself. It marks the first corner of the resort." A hush settled. Even the wind seemed to pause. Then applause, soft, respectful. A few claps, nothing showy. But real. I turned slowly. One of the phones was streaming live. I looked into it, not with anger, not with bitterness, just clarity. "Healing doesn't mean silence," I said. "It means truth." I let the words land. No rush. Then I stepped back. A woman near the back wiped her eye. A teenager whispered to his dad. "She built all of this." I walked back toward the veranda. The crowd dispersed naturally, no cue, no signal. Just understanding. Garrett stayed behind. Nina remained near the cameras, frozen eyes following me but no longer seeing. Back in my room later, I sat on the edge of the bed and breathed. Not victory, not revenge. Just air. Fresh and full. And for the first time since I arrived, I didn't feel like a guest. I felt present. I had told my story not with bitterness, but with bricks and benches and sunlight. And someone listened. Now I'd like to hear from you. If your voice had been silenced in your own home, what would you do? A. Stay quiet to keep peace. B. Speak gently but firmly. C. Let actions show your worth. D. Walk away with your dignity. The door to the administrative office shut softly behind Nina. She stood in the center of the room, arms folded, voice low but firm. "I just think it's time we update the documentation," she said. "New branding, new ownership, streamlined messaging. We don't need outdated credits confusing the narrative." Mr. Dalton, the property's legal coordinator, looked up from his desk. Late 60s wire rim glasses, a blue pen perched behind one ear. "Outdated credits," he repeated, as if tasting the words. "Yes," Nina said. "We appreciate the original architect's contribution, but her name on internal files, well, it sends a mixed message. This is a new era." Dalton adjusted his glasses, then turned toward the filing cabinet behind him. He pulled out a thick, worn folder labeled Founding Design, HL. I've worked at this resort since its third year, he said, laying the file gently on the table. I saw Miss Lowell present her plans to the county board. I watched her pour concrete herself. Nina's lips tightened. With respect, she said carefully, I'm sure she was valuable at the time. But in today's digital space, audiences respond better to a cohesive brand. Dalton opened the file. Inside were scans of original blueprints, notes in handwriting, letters on official letterhead from the California Architecture Board, and near the back, slightly faded but intact, a photo of Henny wearing a hard hat smiling next to the first load of timber beams. That name, Dalton said, tapping the corner of the folder, is part of the Architecture Board's record. We can't erase it. We won't. Nina said nothing for a moment, then gave a tight, businesslike smile. Well, I hope you won't be offended if we promote the current experience over the past. Dalton didn't blink. Not offended, he said. Just loyal to facts. Nina left without slamming the door, but the air behind her felt colder than before. Lila, who had been restocking brochures at the corner desk, pretended not to watch. But as soon as the room quieted, she stepped closer to the folder Dalton had left half open on the desk. Is it true? She asked softly. She built all of this. Dalton nodded. From scratch, back when people said a woman couldn't do it. Lila's eyes moved across the page-lined diagrams, slope calculations annotations in neat block letters. Then the photo. Henny 20 years younger, still that calm steadiness in her face, the same eyes. Lila's fingers hesitated. May I? Dalton looked up, then gently slid the folder toward her. You can make a copy, he said. Just one. Keep it quiet. She nodded, lifted the page with both hands. The copier in the back hummed to life. A moment later, Lila tucked the page carefully into the inside pocket of her linen vest. Not for social media. Not for drama. Just for remembering. Because some names shouldn't be buried. And some stories don't stay erased. The library was quiet except for the soft creak of the wicker chair beneath me and the occasional rustle of pages turning in the corner. Afternoon light filtered through the high windows, casting long golden bars across the floor. I sat near the bookshelf labeled Local History, pretending to read, though my eyes hadn't moved past the same paragraph in 10 minutes. A soft knock at the door. Not loud, not urgent. Come in, I said. Lila stepped inside, holding something pressed between her palms. Her linen vest was slightly wrinkled, a smudge of ink on her finger. Sorry to interrupt, she said quietly. I just thought you might want this back. She extended the paper toward me carefully, like it was fragile. I took it with both hands. It was the photograph, the one from the archive folder. Me in a hard hat standing beside the timber beams, my smile wider than I remembered. Freckles, no makeup, no pretense. I hadn't seen that version of myself in years. Maybe décades. For a while I said nothing. The silence didn't feel empty, just full in a different way. Lila sat across from me, folding her hands in her lap. She didn't ask for explanation. She didn't fill the air. She waited. I traced the edge of the photograph with my thumb. I'd almost forgotten what I looked like, I murmured. When I believed in myself. Lila blinked. Didn't speak. I used to be the woman who designed entire buildings from memory, I continued. Angles, materials, load calculations, no second guessing. You still are, Lila said, barely above a whisper. I looked up at her. She meant it. No flattery, no pity. Just truth. I glanced down again. In the picture, my posture was straighter, my eyes clear. I remembered how the sun hit that day sharp and high, bouncing off the steel like it had something to say. I didn't build this place for aesthetics, I said. I built it for belonging. Lila leaned back in the chair, eyes on the floor. It's strange. I walk these halls every day and I never knew. Most people don't, I said. Sometimes legacy gets painted over. We sat in silence again. Not uncomfortable. More like mutual breath. Then I folded the photograph and pressed it gently between my palms, just for a moment, like warming a stone. Not to hide it, to hold it. Thank you, I said. Lila nodded once. You're welcome. She lingered a second longer, then left the room with the same quiet grace she had entered. I sat there a while longer. No music, no camera, no one asking for sound bites or statements, just me, and a memory, and the soft press of paper against my skin reminding me that I hadn't disappeared. I had just been waiting to be seen again. The clock ticked past midnight. Still, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, knees tucked beneath an old wool blanket, fingers resting on the leather cover of my first sketchbook. The edges were frayed corners softened from years of use. A faint coffee stain curved along the bottom like a smile. Outside, the resort was quiet. Lanterns lining the paths still flickered their light, dancing on dew-soaked stone. I opened the sketchbook slowly. The paper inside had yellowed, some pages curled slightly at the edges. Pencil marks faded into the grain, but the shape still held. Arches, angles, notes in margins. North-facing light for morning calm. Seat backs angled at 102 degrees, support over style. I traced one of the drawings with the tip of my finger. This one, the courtyard fountain. I remembered sketching it on a napkin first, then redrawing it at 2 a.m. with rain tapping the roof above me. That night, the first night of the build. It had rained hard, cold, sharp rain that stung the skin. I stood in the mud with a flashlight wedged under my chin, trying to steady my hands enough to mark out the east corner. The wind had torn half the site map. My boots sank deeper with every step, but I didn't flinch. Because it was mine. Because I knew it would stand. I turned the page. Tucked in the back pocket was a note I had kept folded for years, creased and worn, handwriting familiar. My husband's. He had written it just weeks before his illness overtook him. If they forget your name, make sure they still walk your path. I read it again, then again. He knew. Long before I did. Knew that legacy was never in the plaque or the photo or the speech. It was in the way morning light hit the east wall, in how a grandmother's knees didn't ache after sitting too long. In the quiet curve of a bench no one noticed but everyone felt. I pressed the note flat between my palms, held it there. The air in the room was cool. Not cold, the kind that makes you breathe slower, think deeper. I looked out the window. The footpath I'd designed curved gently toward the garden. The bricks still held, even now, especially now. I reached for the pencil tucked in the back of the sketchbook and turned to a blank page. I didn't know what I'd draw yet, but I knew I wasn't done. I placed my hand flat on the page, and for the first time in years I didn't feel forgotten. I felt called. The sun had barely risen when I walked back into the library. The air still carried the cool hush of early morning, and the shelves stood quiet-lined like old friends. I wore my soft canvas jacket and carried my sketchbook tucked under one arm, creased leather, still warm from being held through the night. I moved to the large oak table by the window. The same spot I'd sat in yesterday, only this time. I didn't come to remember. I came to build. I laid the sketchbook down, gently open to a fresh page. Pencil in hand, I drew the first line. Clean. Decisive. Then the curve of an entry path. A series of angled benches. Notes formed in the margins before I even realized I was writing them. Hidden shade point for mid-afternoon rest. Natural slope wheelchair safe, no grading needed. The door creaked open behind me. Footsteps. I didn't look up. Not yet. A voice spoke, soft, steady. Miss Lowell. Leela. I turned slightly. She stood there holding a notepad, brows drawn together like she wasn't sure if she was interrupting or arriving. I didn't want to assume, she said, but if you're working on something I'd really like to watch. Behind her, two more young staffers hovered. One wore a groundskeeper badge. The other held a tray of breakfast muffins, half forgotten, in his hands. I smiled. Just a little. Come in, I said. Close the door. They moved quietly, pulling chairs close to the table. Lila set her pad down. The boy with the muffins blinked as I handed him a mechanical pencil. No idea what I'm doing, he muttered. You will, I replied. I flipped to a blank spread. Drew a rectangle. This, I said, isn't a room. It's air, light, movement. What you decide to place around it, that's what people feel. Not the drawing, the space it makes. Leela nodded slowly, eyes fixed. The others leaned in. No phones. No cameras. Just graphite, paper, breath. I paused, then pushed the sketchbook to the center of the table. We'll start where no one sees, I said. The foundations. No one asked for a story. No one asked about Nina, or the live stream, or the past. They just listened. Listened like what I was offering mattered. And maybe it did. Maybe the quiet work, the kind done at oak tables before sunrise, was the real legacy. Maybe I didn't need to be remembered loudly. As long as someone kept building, I leaned back in the chair. The room glowed with morning light sliding slowly across the page. And just like that, we began. Garrett found me near the stone steps that led down to the lower garden. I had gone there after the morning session in the library, needing air, not silence. The breeze carried the scent of rosemary and wet stone. My sketchbook was tucked under one arm, the pages still warm from so many hands. Mom, he called gently, not quite a question, not quite an apology. I turned. He stood at the top of the steps, hesitant. He hadn't worn that look since he was 10, caught sneaking a flashlight under his blanket to read past bedtime. Can we talk? He asked. I nodded, took a seat on the bench beside the path. He sat beside me, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. I've been watching, he said. I didn't answer. He ran his thumb over his palms, staring at the gravel. Everyone's talking about your tour, about the live stream clips. Even Nina saw the hashtags. She's trying to spin it, say it's part of a broader story. I smiled faintly. She does love control. Garrett exhaled. I guess I didn't see it. What this place meant to you. I knew you designed it, sure, but I didn't know how much of you was still in it. I looked at him. The same cheekbones I once kissed after soccer games. The same hands I held through nightmares. He meant well, but good intentions don't always equal understanding. I'm not stepping back, I said quietly. I'm stepping into what's mine. He blinked. I thought you wanted distance, peace, time off. I wanted respect, I replied. And when I couldn't find it in your plans, I found it in the walls, in the people still willing to listen. He looked at me, really looked. You think I chose Nina over you? I think I said you chose ease over truth. That landed. Soft but sharp. He didn't defend himself. Didn't try to pivot or deflect. He just sat there, the weight of something finally settling where it belonged. You were always the glue, he whispered. Even before Dad passed, I just thought, maybe this trip was a way to rest. Rest isn't erasure, I said. He nodded. We listened to the wind move through the low hedges. Somewhere nearby, a fountain trickled its usual song. Consistent, patient. I don't want to lose you, he said. You haven't, I replied. But if you want me in your life truly, you'll need to make space for the whole of me, not the edited version. He looked down, then back at me. I can do that. I stood slowly, bones reminding me of their years, but heart steadier than it had been in days. I touched his shoulder, then nodded toward the garden. Come on, I said. Let me show you the place your father asked to be buried. You've walked past it 100 times. He followed. No more words. Just footsteps, his beside mine again. We walked in silence down the garden path bordered with time and weathered stones. Garrett followed just behind me, his footsteps slowing as we neared the south wall, the oldest part of the resort, the section guests rarely noticed. Ivy clung to the stacked stone and the bench nearby sagged slightly in the middle, exactly as it had for years. I paused in front of a low alcove. To most, it looked like a decorative recess, maybe left unfinished by design, but buried within the stone just behind the thin slats of cedar was a memorial. No plaque, no inscription. Just a single smooth river rock embedded into the center. That one, I said, pointing we carried back from Taos. He picked it, said it had weight without hardness. Garrett stepped closer, eyes soft. Is this where? I nodded. Your father didn't want a headstone, I said. He said he wanted to rest in the middle of something growing, alive. Garrett crouched down, fingers brushing the stone gently. I've walked past this so many times. Most people do, I said. And that's okay. It's not here for attention. It's here to root everything quietly. We sat on the bench. The early sun filtered through the ivy, casting dappled light across our hands. He told me, I began, voice barely above the breeze, that one day I'd have to fight for what I made, that people would try to smooth my name out of the edges. Garrett turned toward me, guilt hovering behind his eyes. But he was wrong, I said. I won't fight alone. I looked at him fully then, not as a child, not as a man navigating cameras and contracts, but as someone who had once clung to my shirt on his first day of school and now sat still, letting truth press into him. You're here, I said. That counts. He nodded, lips pressed tight, emotion unsaid but understood. For a long time neither of us spoke. Only the sound of the wind through the leaves and somewhere far off a door closing with a soft click. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a small folded paper, the copied photograph Lila had given me. I opened it slowly, smoothing the crease with my palm, then tucked it gently behind the ivy just above the stone. A reminder, I said, more to myself than to him. He stood first, offered me his hand. I took it. And together we walked back up the path, past the edges of what had been hidden, toward what needed to be seen. Now I want to ask you, if you were erased from something you built with your whole heart, would you stay silent to keep peace, or step forward and reclaim your name? A. Let it go, move on quietly. B. Speak up with grace and truth. C. Take action quietly like Henny D. Walk away and build something new. Nina's voice echoed through the main hall, smooth and rehearsed. Today we're bringing something special. An intergenerational conversation about legacy creation and healing spaces. Garrett stood near the back, arms folded. I was seated off to the side, not expecting to speak. The crowd had gathered for another of Nina's live stream panels. This time, the resort had cleared a small atrium for it. Folding chairs, hanging ferns, glasses of infused water balanced on wicker trays. Nina wore soft beige and a coral scarf. Her smile was wide, but her eyes tracked every movement in the room. And she continued, her voice, laced with performative warmth. We're honored to welcome the original designer of this beautiful space, Henrietta Lowell. The audience turned. My name hung in the air like a stone skipping once, twice, waiting to sink. I stood slowly, didn't rush, didn't smile, just walked to the empty seat beside Nina. She gestured with an open hand. Would you like to share a few words? I could feel the cameras, the chat feeds scrolling behind the lens. This wasn't an olive branch. It was a spotlight trap. Make me stumble, freeze, speak with bitterness, or stumble with age. But I had built too many things to misstep on this floor. I adjusted the microphone gently. My name is Henrietta Lowell, I said, voice calm. I designed this resort nearly 2 decades ago. A pause, a stillness. I designed it for comfort, not spectacle, for warmth, for memory, for the people no one usually builds for. Nina smiled tightly, as if waiting for her turn to pivot the narrative. I didn't give her space. This place wasn't drawn in pixels. It was drawn in sweat and wind and decisions made at dusk when you're tired but not allowed to be wrong. A ripple moved through the audience. Some nodded. Someone set their phone down, stopped filming. Nina leaned in slightly. And how do you feel seeing it evolve? Her voice was sweet. I turned to her. I believe evolution and erasure are not the same, I said. Silence. Then a few quiet exhales. The kind of pause that makes people shift in their chairs, not out of discomfort but recognition. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lash out. But I didn't look away. I folded my hands in my lap and waited. This time it was Nina who blinked first. After the panel ended, people didn't rush toward Nina. They turned to me. One woman in a pale blue shawl approached first. You mentioned the benches were angled. I always wondered why my back felt better sitting here. I nodded. 102 degrees. It supports the spine without forcing posture. She smiled genuinely and moved on. Then came a man in his 70s with a camera hanging from his neck. Do you mind if I take your photo next to the fountain? I'd like to include you in my design blog. I raised an eyebrow. Design blog? He chuckled. 50,000 readers, all over 60. They'll love you. I didn't pose. Just stood beside the fountain I had carved into a crescent moon 20 years ago. The man snapped 3 shots, nodded in thanks. Behind me I heard murmurs, questions, staff pointing out features with new reverence. They say she drew that curve by hand. She angled the skylight so the moonlight hits that plant shelf in September. Everywhere I walked, people followed, not with noise, but with attention. Meanwhile, across the courtyard, Nina was unraveling. I caught her voice from behind the linen partition. "I told you not to let her take over the panel," she hissed. "Why was there no time limit?" A young staffer responded meekly. She spoke for 4 minutes. You thought," Nina snapped. "You're here to execute, not think." The staffer lowered her head. Nina noticed someone nearby with a phone raised. She spun around. "Turn that off." Too late. It had already streamed. From a guest's account, the comments flooded in. "She just scolded that employee like a child. Why is she afraid of the architect getting credit?" Unfollowed. I didn't say anything. I just kept walking, my pace steady, my feet tracing paths I had drawn decades ago with nothing but a stubby pencil and a builder's belief. One woman caught up to me. "Do you teach?" I paused. I didn't. But maybe. I'm starting again. She grinned. "Good. We need more women who don't disappear when they're told to." I laughed, not bitterly, not sharply. Just full. She wasn't wrong. By sunset, the apology post went live. A soft-filtered photo of Nina hands clasped standing near the herb garden. The caption read, "We honor the shoulders we stand on. Grateful for the original architect whose quiet strength built our foundation. Healing begins with acknowledgement." Comments poured in. Not praise. Not forgiveness. Too late. You tried to erase her and got caught. This isn't healing, it's PR. One reply simply said, "Give her the mic." Again. I didn't reply. Didn't share it. Didn't like it. I was on the east terrace watching the shadows grow long across the tiles I'd laid myself when Mr. Dalton approached. He held a folder in one hand. A letter tucked inside. "The board met," he said. "They'd like to bring you on as official heritage consultant. Not symbolic. Real decisions. Your voice. Your terms." I looked at him steady. "Why now?" He shrugged. "Because your silence said more than their speeches." I accepted the letter. Didn't sign it yet. Just let the weight of it sit in my lap like a stone pulled from deep water. From behind me, I heard voices. Guests still on their evening walks. One stopped and pointed toward a small carving in the wall. "That's hers," someone whispered. I smiled. Not wide, but enough. Nina didn't speak to me again that day. She passed me twice, once near the reflecting pool, once near the west stair. Both times her eyes found the ground. And that was fine. I wasn't waiting for her to make it right. Some things don't need to be fixed to be finished. Later, as the sky deepened into a velvet blue, Garrett sat beside me again. No words. Just a presence. I leaned back in the chair, palms resting on the arms wood I had chosen for warmth, not trend. "Funny," I murmured. "Some things speak louder when you stop shouting." He looked at me. And nodded. The wind picked up, brushing the pages of my old sketchbook beside us. A design never used. A note once dismissed. But still here. Still speaking. I moved into the lakeside studio on a Thursday morning before the sun had fully stretched its fingers over the water. It was a modest place, 2 rooms, a kitchenette, a worn oak floor that creaked politely with each step. The windows, tall and old, framed the lake like a gallery painting. From every angle there was light. And silence. No housekeeping carts rumbling down the hallway. No schedule taped to the fridge. No one telling me what looked on brand. Just me. And space. Space that didn't need permission to belong to me. The first box I opened held my sketchbook. The leather cover was cracked edges, soft with time. I held it a moment before setting it down on the table. Then came the cloth bundle of old blueprints, creased, faded, wrapped in the same hand-dyed linen I'd used since 2007. It still smelled faintly of cedar and dust. I unfolded them gently. One sheet was slightly warped, the corners curled like leaves. Another bore a smudge from the night we miscalculated the roof slope and ran into a thunderstorm. I could still remember the sound of the rain hitting the drafting tent. How I had laughed not because it was funny, but because I was tired and soaked and alive. I didn't smooth the wrinkles, didn't erase the lines. I let them speak. There was something sacred in those imperfections, trials etched into ink, resilience pressed into measurements. They were more than designs, they were proof. By dusk, I had lit a single lamp beside the drafting table. Its amber glow spilled across the paper like morning light on tile. I made a pot of tea, poured it into a chipped blue mug I'd used for over a decade, and pulled a fresh notebook from the shelf. No title, no table of contents. But I knew what it would become. A manual, a guide. Not for fame. For women like me who'd spent a lifetime making spaces for others and were now carving space for themselves. I picked up a pen and wrote the first line. Lesson 1. Know where your name lives and make sure it stays. Asterisk, asterisk. I stared at it. Then added. Lesson 2. If they don't invite you to the table, measure the room anyway, build it, make it yours. Asterisk. The pen moved faster after that. Lesson 3. Sweat is memory. Let it show. Asterisk. I paused only when the kettle hissed again, bringing me back to the room. Outside, the lake shimmered under a half moon. The ripples curled toward the dock like the hand of an old friend. Somewhere in the distance, lights blinked on at the main lodge, familiar but far now, fading into something I didn't have to answer to. I flipped to another page. Sketched a window facing south, its light carefully angled to catch morning warmth without glare. Underneath it, I wrote, Let light in. Not applause. And then I sat back. The chair creaked as my spine found its place curving into something steady. My hands rested on the wood I had chosen for utility, not trend. My breath evened. My thoughts settled like dust after movement. No name on a banner. No trending soundbite. Just pages filling. Quietly, purposefully, and for the first time in a long time, I felt not just useful. I felt whole. Late afternoon, a gentle knock tapped against the studio door. I wiped the graphite dust from my fingers, still fresh from sketching a staircase that curved like a river, and opened it. Lila stood there. No clipboard, no badge, just a canvas tote hanging from her shoulder and a quiet look in her eyes. May I come in? She asked. I stepped aside. Of course. She moved slowly, careful not to disturb anything, though the space was lived in. Now blueprints stacked on one end of the table, tea cooling on a coaster made of slate. The scent of cedar mixed with dried lavender I'd hung above the stove. I brought something, she said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a small notepad dog-eared and filled with sticky notes. Some of us have been meeting after shifts. Talking design, practice sketches, floor plans. We wanted to show you. She laid the pad down like it might break. I didn't open it right away. Instead, I watched her face hopeful, a little afraid. Why now? I asked softly. Leela hesitated. Then, with more courage than volume, she said, Because when we saw you speak, we didn't just see you, we saw ourselves, the part we keep tucking away so we don't seem too much. That landed. I picked up the notepad and flipped through. The sketches were rough, corners unmeasured, lines wandering. But there was intention there, thoughtfulness. Some pages even had notes about how a space would feel soft morning light, warm tile under bare feet corner seat for someone who doesn't like crowds. My throat tightened. She looked up. How do you know when something's worth fighting for? The room stilled. I didn't rush an answer. Instead, I stood and crossed to the low bookshelf, reached behind a row of books and pulled out a small stone, rounded, smooth, carved faintly with the initials JL, my husband's. I handed it to her. She turned it in her palm. It's from the memorial wall, I said. My husband asked to be buried, not with a headstone, but in a wall no one notices. He said, if they forget my name, let them still walk in what I helped build. She held the stone close. I never answered your question, I said. But maybe this will. I returned the stone to the shelf gently. Then I turned back to her. If you had to protect something no one else sees, I asked, would you still do it? She nodded slowly. Yes, I would. Then you already know. We stood in silence, teacher and student, though no class had ever begun. Then I picked up her notepad again, flipped to a blank page, and handed her a pencil. Lesson 1, I said. We draw not just what's seen, we draw what's felt. She smiled, eyes bright. And without another word, we began to sketch. 1 year later, the garden had grown fuller. The ivy on the south wall draped lower now, its green woven through the cracks like memory reclaiming space. The stone benches had softened at the edges, worn smooth by use, not time. Guests gathered in the central courtyard for the resort's 20-year celebration. There was a stage, small, temporary, decorated with lanterns and early fall blooms. Someone had placed a bronze plaque near the reflecting pool that read, "Designed by Henrietta Lowell. For rest, for rhythm, for return. Asterisk." But I wasn't there. I was 50 miles away, sitting on a wooden deck that faced the lake, watching the sun rise through a gap I'd designed decades earlier into the lodge's east eaves. Instead of speaking on stage, I had written a letter. It rested now in Lila's hands, sealed with a linen ribbon and tucked between her fingers like something sacred. She stepped to the microphone slowly, her posture steady in the early evening light. She asked me to read this, Lila began. Word for word. She unfolded the letter carefully. To those gathered today, she read, I want to thank you not for applause, but for attention. Attention is the purest form of respect. It listens, it remembers, it builds. A few heads bowed slightly. I did not design these walls to hold my name. I designed them to hold you, your silence, your laughter, your grief, your return. Lila paused, eyes flicking across the crowd. Garrett stood near the back, hands clasped. I have been many things in my life. A mother, a wife, an architect. But in the quiet of this last year, I have become something else, a teacher without a classroom. A foundation no one sees but everyone stands on. Soft rustling among the guests. Someone wiped their eyes. And if you walk these paths and feel peace, if your shoulders drop, if your breath slows, then the design worked. It still speaks. Lila's voice caught slightly, but she continued. Thank you for letting me be invisible when needed and visible when it mattered. She folded the letter again gently. And for a long moment, no one said anything. The garden held its breath. Then someone clapped. Then another. But Lila didn't linger. She stepped down from the stagehand, still holding the letter, and walked toward the bench under the sycamore. The same one angled to support your lower back. The same one no one noticed until they sat. That evening, long after the last lantern dimmed and the guests had returned to their rooms, Lila walked the winding path back to the lakeside studio. The air smelled of damp soil and late-blooming sage. Each step felt like a soft exhale after a long breath held too long. The moon hung low over the water, its reflection steady and unbothered like a teacher watching from a distance. She carried the letter Henny had written now, folded neatly inside her pocket, and the applause from earlier still echoed faintly in her chest, not for her, but for something she was now part of. She unlocked the door with the quiet reverence of someone entering a space not just used but loved. Inside, nothing had changed. A single lamp glowed in the corner, casting an amber wash over the drafting table. The wood grain of the surface bore faint etchings, and the memory of elbows leaned into work. A mug with cold tea sat beside a closed sketchbook. The room was filled with the residue of thought. Atop the table sat a notebook. The same one Henny had started the year before. For the Women Who Build was printed across the cover in firm block lettering. Lila ran her fingertips along the edge, then opened it to the last marked page. The final entry stopped mid-thought. Lesson 14. When they call you difficult, remember, steel bends for no one. Asterisk. Her throat tightened. A smudge of graphite, where Henny's thumb must have rested, still marked the page. A small sign, a trace. It made her feel both lonely and deeply held. She sat slowly on the stool, the wood creaking as she settled in. The pencil beside the notebook was dulled but not yet worn out. She picked it up and stared at the lines below. So much blank space. And still nothing felt empty. Lila began to write. Lesson 15 legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's who picks up the pen. Asterisk, asterisk. She paused. Waited. The air shifted, nothing supernatural, just stillness clearing itself like a curtain lifting in a quiet theater. She kept writing. Lesson 16. You don't need to build loud to be remembered. Just honest, asterisk. Each sentence landed gently like carefully placed stones, not heavy, just sure. Outside, a breeze stirred the curtains. A wind chime sounded further down the lake, 3 soft notes, familiar and full. The same chime Garrett had once hung in memory of his father. She flipped to a blank page and drew a window. South-facing. Measured for light and privacy. At the bottom in smaller print, she added, Let the light fall where it's never fallen before. Asterisk. Then she closed the notebook, slowly, hands resting atop it. She didn't look for approval. Didn't need permission. The studio, the walls, the legacy, they were already speaking. She was just continuing the conversation. One line at a time,